but we'll try and do that. Any other observations, problems, concerns?
Yes, but let's just...
Huh? Nothing.
See if they arise.
Nothing you can nail down, you mean? Okay. All right. I do want to, because there is a kind of continuity between the Prolegomena and where the book leaves off with Heidegger, and also because we didn't really get as far into Heidegger as I would like to last time. I'd like to just backtrack a little bit, which is a Heideggerian thing to do, into that chapter, and maybe on page 281. Maybe starting, let's do the leap. On page 280 at the bottom, where he's talking about the belonging together of man and being, and maybe 10 lines or so up from the bottom of 280. In what direction does the leap from the ground point? Is it heading for an abyss? It does so indeed, so long as we picture ourselves the leap and do so more specifically within the scope of metaphysical thought. It does not head for an abyss insofar as we leap and let ourselves go. In what direction? We are going to where we are already embedded into the fold of being. Yet being itself is our very own. For only in man can being be domiciled, that is to say, can it be present. Hence we must leap in order that we may experience in our own person the belonging together of man and being. This leap is the precipitous homing without benefit of bridges into that belongingness which alone man and being as mutually related and hence their pattern can provide. The leap is the sudden return into the realm where man and being are already found together in their essence, because both were assigned to each other in a sufficiency. It is not until the entry into the sphere of this mutual assignation is effected that thought experience becomes attuned to it and determined. And then the end of that quote. So here we have Heidegger's leap, which ought to remind us, at least formally, of the Kierkegaardian leap of faith, and yet this leap is a leap in which man, or we, as those ones who make the leap, find ourselves having leapt in this belonging together with being, which is a sufficiency, which in a certain sense, by leaping, we discover what you might call a support that one can assume is there all along, or is in some deep sense originally there. So I say toward the top of 281 after the quote, man leaps into his very own being, letting go the support of traditional metaphysics, that is, his conceptualization of being itself as a reason for existence, as well as his thought of himself as a specific individuality. Abandoning all thought of legitimacy, he steps suddenly into the freedom that arises from his own being to meet him in mutual concern, stripped of all previous conceptions. He enters into the security of the deep well of his own being. If modern thought looked for the sufficient reason of the existence of the universe, then in Heidegger this immediate return of man into the realm of his identity with the being of the totality of what is, that is, with his own being, reveals itself as that original mutuality of the essence of man and being, which relationship itself, prior to all thought, constitutes a sufficiency. And the thinking that appreciates or leads up to, and the thinking which appreciates and leads up to this leap, so to speak, or the thinking in which this Heideggerian leap can be thought, is a thinking beyond metaphysics, beyond the end of the first history of man, and as I think comes out even more explicitly in contributions to philosophy, it's a leap into a belongingness with being, which is, as the parenthetical title of the contributions to philosophy indicates, it's a leap into an owning, the eiregness, which is translated differently in different places. Nevertheless, the notion of an owning, by undergoing this leap, one, in a certain sense, man or men come into their own. But as one of the translators emphasizes someplace, this owning in Heidegger, perhaps because it's beyond the metaphysical and scientific realm of thinking, it's not a possessive owning. All right. So in other words, it's not the ownership of the Hegelian first moment of the realization of an abstract freedom, where one owns property in Hegel, as I pointed out, right? That kind of possessive owning, which is the second moment in freedom, but the first moment of a kind of realization of what in the first moment remains only an abstract freedom. So the owning here is not an owning in the way of possession of something out there, some object, right? In other words, so the thinking that Heidegger is doing is one way of understanding it. I mean, there are many different ways of understanding it, but I think one way is that it's a non-objectifying and a non-objective thinking. All right. So it is a. I mean, just to speak metaphorically, it's a kind of a thinking that has its sharp edges removed. Right. It is, in some sense, a kind of amorphousness, a kind of amorphous thinking, a kind of pre, and I think this is part of the thrust of where he's going, in some sense. It's a kind of a pre-metaphysical thinking, or in terms that we were talking about last time, it's a thinking in which one is receptive of being, and therefore, in that sense, it's not an objectification of being that is going on in Heidegger at that point. So in the leap, one, as it were, comes into one's own. One belongs to being and discovers an original, pre-objectifying sufficiency in that belonging to being, in that mutual relationship, which is in its very nature a sufficiency. Which takes us right back almost to the first class, right? One of the other themes that's going on in Western consciousness, Heidegger's, therefore, you can see, is in this sense, he's not an exception to the tradition, even though he's very critical, profoundly and deeply trying to get in and under and before the tradition in some sense to recover something that he feels that has been lost. Right? That's all true, but notice he doesn't have any objection to the fundamental idea, which appears in the tradition, of the sufficiency, right? The autarkes that Plato talks about in the Timaeus. Here we have so we're still into sufficiency. Is the point I'm trying to make. Even though you could say this is not a metaphysical form of sufficiency, right? It is nevertheless the notion of sufficiency is still driving Heidegger at a deeper level, and also, even though the owning or the owning is not a possessive ownership, all right, it nevertheless there continues to be, in a non-metaphysical way, there continues to be still here that root in the self. In other words, we're not talking about the self of self-consciousness, all right? Therefore we're not talking about the self that is absolutely, ultimately intolerant of the independent existence of the other. All right. Here, that question is muted. It's kind of. Did I say muted? Well, yeah, maybe it's muted. I also want to say mooted. It's mooted and muted, right? but self hasn't gone away, right? That is the and owning in the leap is a kind of in the belonging to being. It is the sufficiency of the self, you might say, before in the kind of pre-conscious mode, or pre-consciousness mode might be a more precise way of putting it, and its efficiency of the self in a pre-consciousness relationship with being, a non-metaphysical, non-objectifying relationship with being, such that, and I don't know what the right language here is, if it were metaphysics, it would be a kind of absolute independence of the self. That is to say, a sufficiency in the self, in its original, primordial relationship with being, such that it need not move in a consciousness, as it would in the consciousness realm, to a Hegelian ownership of things, of property, right? It need not go, so to speak, out of itself in any way in order to have the sufficiency, right? So in that sense, it mutes or moots the metaphysical move. Indeed, we may understand that what Heidegger uncovers in the remembrance of being is nothing other than the self-supporting, and there you can read that. I love English. English is a great language for thinking, because English is an inherently ambiguous language. It's the antithesis, I think, of the French ideal of clarity. All right, but the flexibility of reading any English sentence, you see, is probably historically very significant. Nothing other than the self-supporting contingency of the universe, right? So the straight way to read that is the self-supporting contingency of the universe. The universe is contingent universe supports itself, right? But it also, I'm saying ambiguously, but truly, it is supporting, right, of the self, right, in this non-metaphysical sense, in a qua-universe that deep within the abyss of the oblivion of being lies waiting for man the resource of his survival in the world. But that self-assurance that characterizes modern thought as the thought of existence, that in the clarification effected by Heidegger is transformed into a matter of the essence of being, considered in its difference qua difference from existence or from beings. The relationship between man and being is one of their own essence. The guarantee whereby history is thought through to its completion in man, that guarantee absolute in Hegel, is in Heidegger suspended in essence. And there I want to slow the film down a little bit, all right? So that, in other words, that the guarantee whereby history is thought through to its completion in man, that guarantee, which is absolute in Hegel, you could say absolutely completed in the internal movement of the self-realization of absolute reason. That guarantee is not just as I was saying a moment ago. The self is not obliterated in Heidegger, right? The self of self-consciousness is muted, mooted, right? Gotten underneath. Well, likewise, that magnificent absolute sufficiency, right, or self-sufficiency that we see in the Hegelian absolute synthesis, that sufficiency, that completeness is, as sufficiency, as completeness is not set aside by Heidegger, right? But it is found, it is what, as I say in this sense, it is suspended in essence. And here I'm kind of playing on the notion of the being between the first history and the second history in Heidegger, right? So in this middle ground, in this place, even that's probably not the right word, into this what otherwise would be an abyss, into this belonging together of man and being, into which we leap, all right, in Heidegger, we find what? We are, as it were, buoyed up, right, in the discovery of this original sufficiency in the belonging together, and that is a kind of suspension, right? And that that which is in between there is in some sense this, for want of a better term, this kind of non-metaphysical essence. Now that I'm thinking now, for example, of Husserl and what Husserl does with the notion of essence, right? Essence is that invariable that is discovered by the going through all of the possible variations and focusing on what in all the variation of anything that one has considered, all the various kinds of worlds, all the various kinds of trees. I mean, just to be really concrete about it, right? What does not change, right? What is invariable, what is a constant there, is effectively what the phenomenological essence is. And so here we have a kind of derationalizing of that essence as invariant, right? So I mean this in a very concrete sense. I wouldn't say universalizing of that essence, but the universing, the taking that essence in terms of what is existence as a whole, right? Existence as or what is in totality, as it's translated in this text. Taking that essence in those terms, then we have the I want to say the ground which is no ground. We have the foundation which is no foundation here. What Heidegger calls in the contributions book the Abgrund, okay, but which is not the same thing as a groundlessness, right? In other words, Abgrund, the ground away, the removal of the ground, is for Heidegger, that removal is not a simple nothingness. It's not a blank. That lack of a ground, right, is a support. So underneath, behind, before, underneath the metaphysical history of man's being in the world, there is this Abgrund, right? There is this what from a so just as it appears that the leap is into an abyss from a metaphysical point of view, you see, from a metaphysical point of view, it would appear that that the alternative to the metaphysical foundation is a groundlessness. Okay, but Heidegger is that the whole thing he wants to emphasize is that the removal of the metaphysical, I'll say, objectified notion of a ground. You see, the notion of a ground as some sort of an object. All right, the removal of that conceptualization of the ground is not the removal altogether of support. Right, and that support is more original. It's pre-metaphysical, if you want. Okay, and so therefore so we're not doing away with all the meaning of essence, but we're suspending this essence, you see, in this non-objectified realm between. Yeah.
There's something about this idea of going back to or returning that you've mentioned, which I think there's a subtlety that's kind of important to think, which is that it's never suggested that this is going back to something that was actually realized in the ancient Greek world. It's precisely something that wasn't thought there.
That's right.
So when it's dealing with aletheia or all the various other things, he's actually going to something new. Although the way to go there is through another beginning from the same source. It's like,
It's almost like the two roads that diverge in the woods.
Okay, we'll go back to the other one.
So it's not going back to a road that was taken, it's going back to the road that wasn't taken.
Right.
Yes. Okay. All right. All right. The other one on 287, worth noting, is, and this gives me a chance to say something about Leibniz that I wanted to say originally, and there's this deep connection between what Heidegger's doing and what Leibniz was doing. As Heidegger points out, Leibniz asks the question, basically, why is there being rather than nothing? And then, speaking of two roads, Leibniz went down the being road, so to speak, in that question. Right, say? And so if we go back, forget the Greeks a moment. I mean, don't forget them, but bracket them a moment.
Well, I think Hegel does this for each epoch of being
yeah,
he's
okay.
concerned with. This is another one of these forking paths.
Right, okay. So if you go back to Leibniz said being or nothing. Why is there being rather than nothing? And he went, as it were, down the being road, and Heidegger now wants to go down that nothing road, all right? But what I wanted to say, in the larger context of what we're about here, is that the fact that Leibniz asked the question that he asked, and the fact that he asked it the way he asked it, is significant, right? And I don't think I said this in class, but I want to say it now. If I didn't, and if I did, I want to emphasize it. That, and it's an important point. It's not. I don't know. It's a major point, but it's an important point in the Faith and Philosophy book. Is that Descartes is the one who, in a certain sense, really starts this particular question moving, because Descartes, in the Meditations, he's got so many problems to deal with in a short little book like he does, right? And one of the many, many problems that Descartes has is trying to establish his relationship to God and to the universe and so forth and so on. And Descartes' way of solving the problem is, which I try and emphasize in Faith and Philosophy, despite the fact that this I don't think is widely appreciated, is that Descartes is not Hegel, that Descartes does not believe in the nothingness of the finite. Okay, I mean, believe intellectually in the nothingness of the finite. The whole point of the Meditations for Descartes is that he is not nothing as a finite being. Do you see? That's very clear. I mean, it's very clear in the text of Descartes. It can be obscured by somebody like Hegel, or if you're looking at the world through a Hegelian lens. But Descartes and Hegel are not in agreement on this point. And so for Descartes, poor little finite Descartes thinker, all right, it's very important to him that he is not nothing. That's very significant, right? That's his. In fact, speaking of metaphysical foundations, that's his foundation. Right? No matter what I am, I am. Okay. All right. So not only is the infinite in Descartes positive infinity, but now I could say the finite in Descartes is a positive finitude. It's not right. You see, all right. However, that said, we can't let him completely off the hook here, right? That said, he then positions himself between this infinite being and nothing. Do you see? So in other words, he's a finite being. That's his relationship. He's a mean proportional. You see, he is literally a mean proportional, logically speaking, analogically speaking, between the infinite being, which God is, unqualified being, you might say, you see, and an unqualified nothing. Right? Like God, as finite, he is. He's not a nothingness, a la Hegel. See? So he's got being, but he's got a finite addition of it. But that puts him in the middle. Right? On the other hand, because he's finite, because he's not infinite being, right, then he has some kind of negation attached to his being, right? The limitation. And the extreme of that fact, on the other end of the spectrum, is nothing. So Descartes, in order to define himself as the finite being who is not simply nothing, right, nevertheless has to pose himself as the mean proportional between God and nothing. So now what he has done is he has created with himself as the mean proportional, he has created a proportion between infinite being and nothing. Right? And right there is where he departs from Thomas. Right? Because I think I pointed out to you maybe, I don't know if it was in this context or not, but in obviously a related context, that for Thomas there is no proportionality between the creator, God, and the creature, or the totality of creation for that matter. There's no proportionality. And Thomas, being a good thinker, thinkers always contradict themselves, right? Now then gives us a proportion to prove that there's no proportion, right? And now listen to the proportion. The proportion is that the distance between the creator and the creation. Now, I'll start at the other end. It'll be easier. The distance between the lowest creature, whatever that might be, pick your favorite lowest creature, and the supreme creation, which would be the highest angel, right? So between the highest creature, the most excellent created being, and the least excellent created being, says Thomas, the distance between those two, between the highest created being and the lowest, the distance between those two creatures is as, see, this is the subtle difference, is as nothing compared to the distance between the creator and the creature. So the distance between the creator and the creature is infinitely surpasses any real comparison with any natural distance, right? So there's a proportion which denies the proportion, and notice there's a word nothing comes in there as nothing, but God is not compared to nothing. Do you see? Yes, he is in Descartes. The infinite being is not directly compared to nothing. It's the distance between the infinite being and the finite being that is right. You see, is compared to the distance between the creatures, which is a nothing. Yeah.
But how isn't that if you just say infinity is to n, some finite magnitude, as n is to 0? Isn't that really the same in both?
I don't see where's the 0 come in.
Nothing.
No, but it doesn't say that. If I'm hearing you right, infinity is to n, as n is to 0. That's what you're saying. But I read Thomas to be saying infinity is to n.
Oh, I see. It's to the least n.
Right.
Yes.
As, I don't know.
The highest n is to the least n, as God is to any n.
Right. That's the point.
What confuses me, though, is to say that anything is as nothing. Because nothing is nothing. If it's as nothing, isn't it something? It seems to me there's a contradiction in terms of...
let me follow you. If the distance between the creator and creatures, when compared to the distance between any two creatures, no matter how extreme the distance, how big the distance is, if that latter distance is as nothing,
then it's
something.
Be as nothing without being nothing? Yeah. And
No. I thought you said the opposite. I thought you said it's got to be something, right?
Well, if it's as nothing, it's something.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that just call anything as nothing is a contradiction in terms that it's a logical impossibility. Because nothing can't be something. Nothing is nothing.
Nothing is a problem. Nothing is a problem. As you can see. I like what you said the first time as I heard it, but in other words, if that distance between the highest and the lowest creature is as nothing, I think your first instinct would say, well, wait a minute, if it is as nothing, then it isn't nothing.
Yeah.
It's something. Okay.
Correct.
Now that I think is good, because that is to say that in Thomas and in his own way in Descartes, the finite creaturely world, which is what is as nothing in Thomas's proportion, is something. You're right. It is.
So
it's not
when
nothing.
He says something
That's
is
right.
as nothing. It's his little
It's
joke. He knows that
it's his way of saying that there's no comparison. That you ought not. I'm going to make a comparison which demonstrates that there's no comparison. I think it's.
If you say infinity is to something as something is to nothing, then God couldn't even know about you because you're nothing. You can't know about nothing.
Well, now when you say okay, now first of all, we're having this discussion and we understand why, because of all the water that's gone under the bridge between us and Thomas, right? Thomas would not.
No, of course.
He wouldn't sit still for this. Yeah. However, Peirce is very interesting what you just said, because Peirce is a little bit of a detour, but I want to show you how pervasive the nothing is in modern consciousness. Jonathan Edwards, our Puritan forefather there in the colonial period, right? Theologian and philosopher and scientist in his own way. And Jonathan Edwards is adamant about the fact that he has a little early essay on. I use two of them. They're very tied into one another. One is on mind and one is on being. In one of those, he says that the notion of an absolute nothing is an absurdity. I mean, in other words, he goes on ranting and raving about this. There must have been somebody talking about it. So who was it? Leibniz? What? Who? I don't know. This was an issue for Jonathan Edwards. So he spends all of his time saying you cannot conceive of absolute nothing. In effect, what he says is the only nothing that is at all intelligible is a relative nothing. You see, things are there's a relative nothing, but there's no absolute nothing because the mind cannot grasp it. Now, this is Jonathan Edwards. Peirce comes along, whatever, 100 years or so later, and Peirce says, well, it may be that we cannot conceive of nothing. So he gives Edwards that much. Right? But he says, and this is the great thing about Peirce, but we can conceive that there is a mind that can conceive of nothing, right? Which is the mind of God. That's what triggered that. Okay. So for Peirce, it's conceivable that even though we can't conceive of nothing, absolutely, that God could conceive of nothing, absolutely. Right? Now, Peirce doesn't pursue that, but that he puts it out there would suggest it's a clue to what is acceptable to Peirce, namely that there is, in our experience, there is no simple alteration of being and nothing. There's no simple dichotomy, right? And so when he admits the out of boundness of absolute nothing, he has to qualify it by saying, well, yes, we cannot think of it, but the mind of God, we can conceive that the mind of God can think of it, even though, and here he's got himself covered, even though we can have absolutely no understanding of how the divine mind works. So he doesn't pretend. So all he has to know is that there is a divine mind, and that he can know. And this is very Thomistic, very medieval in a way. That we can know if we're Peirce from the effects. We can know that there is a divine mind in some sense at the source of the universe. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able, for example, for Peirce, to do science. Wouldn't be able to do science if there wasn't a divine mind, right, unifying in some fundamental way the universe. All right, well, we got off on that, but so just to go back to what triggered this. So in Descartes, there is this polarity of the infinite being and nothing, in which they are the direct extremes, right, in that proportion of which the finite thinker is the mean proportional, the middle term, the means. All right. Now, so when you say, well, why was it for Leibniz a natural question? Why is there being rather than nothing? You see what I'm driving at? In other words, the question is this direct comparison, right, between being and nothing, right? He compares being and nothing, and then as the root of his question, and then answers in the direction of being. All right. Now Heidegger, starting at the bottom of 286. Heidegger, then, true to the extenuated modernity of his thinking, fails to perceive the discontinuity of the transcendental form of reason with the true metaphysics, and of modern thought with them both. This is quite clear in his treatment of the nothing of sacred doctrine in What is Metaphysics? Christian dogma denies the truth of the proposition ex nihilo nihil fit, and gives a twist to the meaning of nothing, so that it now comes to mean the absolute absence of all being outside of God. All right, so if we just pause there. Now this to me is Heidegger subtly transforms the history of thought, or distorts it would be a more candid way of putting it, okay? But here, there's nothing subtle about what he's doing, all right? In other words, this is a real, it seems, out-and-out mistake. That the nothing is, all right, now notice even though he's profoundly critical of the modern metaphysical tradition, he here is taking uncritically the relationship between being and nothing as a relationship of opposites, of presence and absence. Do you see? And so nothing now becomes for him the absence of all being outside of God. Ex nihilo fit ens creatum, the created being is made out of nothing. Now, I kind of anticipated this passage when I was talking about the distinction between Thomas and Augustine, right? The ambiguity in Augustine's language, de nihilo, as opposed to the sharply defined ex nihilo, the ordered relationship in Thomas. Here, Heidegger takes the de nihilo in a way that that you couldn't even accuse Augustine of doing it, right? In other words, he univocally understands it in the sense that Thomas rules out as the material source, the material cause of the world is nothing. The created being is made out of nothing. Nothing is now the conceptual opposite, and so he says it, of what truly and authentically is. It becomes the summum ens, God as the ens increatum, uncreated. Here, too, the interpretation of nothing points to the fundamental concept of what is. Metaphysical discussion of what is, however, moves on the same plane as the inquiry into nothing. In both cases, the questions concerning being and nothing, as such, remain unasked. Hence, we need not be worried by the difficulty that if God creates out of nothing, he above all must be able to relate himself to nothing. But if God is God, he cannot know nothing, which is what you just said, assuming that the absolute excludes from itself all nullity. This crude historical reminder shows nothing as the conceptual opposite of what truly and authentically is, that is, as the negation of it. Now, see, so in other words, he's reading back into the medieval mind, and certainly, in effect, if he were right, he would have to be reading back into Thomas's mind, but he can't be doing that. In other words, all this says is that he missed that passage in Thomas. Okay, that is, he didn't understand Thomas, is what it comes down to. Now, that's a fundamental mistake to make if you're in the business of reviewing the history, the actual history of Western thought. Do you see what I'm saying? All right, so it's a flaw that is maybe Kierkegaard would say it's that thread that when you pull on it, the whole suit unravels, the one where the tailor forgot to tie the knot at the end, okay? But what is he doing? I mean, where did he get this erroneous notion? Well, he got this erroneous notion from Hegel, right? I mean, in other words, Hegel's whole metaphysics depends upon the opposite alternation of being and nothing. And for Hegel, of course, the dialectical identity of the two, right, of pure being and nothing, right? But nevertheless, that identification is just the dialectical identification of what otherwise alternates in the realm of becoming, right? And so that makes it really. Now we're getting more. I was suspicious enough of Heidegger. Now makes me very suspicious of Hegel. So I go back and I read. Now I haven't done this, but I did it years ago. I go back and I read the history of philosophy. Hegel has a 3-volume work called The History of Philosophy. Right. So, and sure enough, I turn over this. I go through this, and in this 3-volume work, a couple of thousand pages or whatever it is, right? There's one page on Thomas Aquinas. Like there was a medieval philosopher called Thomas Aquinas. Okay. I guess a page worth. All right. So in other words, this is a very right now. Is it Hegel's fault? I mean, what's going on here, right? Now, of course, when you think of modernity, and then you think of what I said about the Peirce as an American, a prototypical American thinker. Well, European modernity is what? It's a project away from the medieval world. Right? It's a project starting with Descartes, right? It's a project, right, that has in principle no appreciation in principle for the medieval background. You say? Whereas when you move over across the Atlantic, you get to somebody like Peirce, a little more literal and psychological and whatever, civil historical distance. He's a little more open to the fact, you see, that there's something going on in the medieval mind that is important and that is not consistent with what begins with Descartes, right? And so American thought is a kind of revision, a kind of, you could say, a kind of correction to that erroneous oversimplification, you see, of the history of thought as it transpires in the European tradition. Yeah.
Can you state the proper understanding of creation ex nihilo in a Thomas sense?
Well, I could try. Creation ex nihilo in a Thomistic sense means it all hinges on the meaning of ex in the Latin, and ex in the Latin is like lots of words, has different meanings depending on the context, right? It can mean out of, in the sense of made out of, or in the sense of coming out of the house, right? Or coming out from the town, leaving from the town, away from something, right? But you have a more technical, abstract meaning, as it were, a simple order. This comes after that. In Latin would be ex that, right? Thomas says that the correct meaning of ex nihilo in the notion of creation ex nihilo is the latter. It's order. It's an order. In other words, there was nothing before the creation. The creation comes after nothing, but not out of it. Not as if it were. What he says precisely, it's not the material cause, okay? Which it would be if, right? So if I'm an Aristotelian and I make a statue out of marble of those four famous Aristotelian causes: formal, final, efficient, and material. Those are the four Aristotelian causes. This is what Thomas is talking about. The material cause of the statue is marble. So the material cause of the world, if nothing were the material cause of the world, then the world would be substantially, as it were, nothing. The being of the world substantially would be nothing. Right. Now, of course, that's what it comes to be in modern consciousness, but it's not the case in Thomas. Thomas has explicitly anticipated in the negative the modern reading. So the seeds of that modern reading were there, otherwise he wouldn't have had to deal with the issue. But he himself is not...
So for Heidegger, the material substance of the universe is nothing. In that
well,
sense.
I don't know that Heidegger is... it gets a little more hairy. It would be in that direction if Heidegger were a metaphysician, maybe you might say that.
Okay.
Or whether if he were creating an ontology in his
yes,
ontological sense,
right.
which he's not.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's what I was talking about, this muting and mooting, all right? So if he were
it would be
doing a traditional ontology, right, or a metaphysics, yes, then that would be the case. So in that sense, he's consistent with Hegel on a number of levels, okay, as far as that goes. But his whole project, so to speak, is to, in some sense, be beyond Hegel by going back and starting over at that crossroads. Okay?
Okay.
So just one more question
sure.
about Thomas. The material cause then of the universe is what?
The material cause of the universe would be matter.
Okay.
But matter is not nothing.
Okay.
Right, which goes back another... Right. So matter is not simply a nothing, right? First matter, we never encounter first matter, right? In other words, all matter in our experience is in form. Now, I don't know whether you just said materia signata. Did you say? Yeah. Okay. So now there are many levels of this, right? So your individuality for Thomas is a function of what he calls materia signata. So a certain specifically formed matter constitutes your individuality. But if you're asked the question about what is the matter of the whole of creation as such, what is the material cause? Mm-hmm. The material cause would be matter, but not in the sense that it would come. That it would ever be experienced as prime matter, that we could ever experience. So when God created the world ex nihilo, there was a first now, which is also cannot be demonstrated, says Thomas, must be believed. But in that context, accepting that principle as an article of faith, then that would mean that the matter and the form of the universe, at least fundamentally in principle, came to be at the same time. Neither the matter nor the form of the creation pre-existed, as it were. Despite what we get in Leibniz, neither pre-existed in Thomas. Okay. All right. Maybe we can... one thing I want to do before I forget, I'll leave it too far. I want to just distribute some notes that I made. They're not very... I took part of this from the one of the answers I gave to Chuck a week or so back, because I think it succinctly states something that it's a kind of a point of reference. And then I have some other stuff I've put on underneath that, some of which should ring a bell or two with you, that the three basic ways of manipulating the syllogistic things. And then I'm trying to relate what I'm saying about Kierkegaard on the forum above there to in that paragraph. Well, maybe I'll take a minute on that because I think it works eventually into today's assignment. I guess the key thing that's relevant there in the quote from the forum, I guess if we start a little below the middle of that paragraph, the thinking now occurring is the moment itself beginning. Beginning exists the moment itself, in the sense in which I was saying that in Kierkegaard, the moment is existed by the individual passionately committed in opposition, in perfect opposition to his own rational, you might say human in this context, self-understanding, right? Committed to an absurd fact, right? Okay, that in a certain sense, what I was calling Kierkegaard's form of existing the moment, and then analogously, so I want to distinguish what's going on in the thinking now occurring from that, and also, all right, so I say beginning exists the moment itself, neither the single individual passionately existing the moment, Kierkegaard, nor the species, rational humanity, pure transcendental subjectivity, existing the moment, Husserl, nor the worlding of the world, existing the moment, Heidegger, but rather the moment existing itself in the form of the thought of the new beginning, in the form of the new beginning of thought, in the form of the beginning of absolute particularity, the beginning of the end of time itself. Above, I'll find the above there. Oh yeah, just above where I started there, again about the middle of the paragraph, a little higher than where I started. In Hegel, the moment itself exists in the form of the absolute now, not beginning, or else beginning, it non-exists. All right. So in other words, once the absolute now or the moment enters into time in Hegel, it enters into non-existence. Right. Insofar as it exists, it's eternal. Insofar as it enters into the temporal flow, it's entering into the nothingness of the finite from a Hegelian point of view. All right. So I'm saying in the thinking now occurring, what we have is the beginning. Now I'm playing here, but it's not just me playing, all right? In other words, this is the play that's going on in the history of thought, and particularly in the history of modern thought, right? When Kant says the angel must have been a little daffy, if we were to take him literally, that time is going to come to an end. That's inconceivable, is what Kant is saying. We haven't yet gotten to Hegel and Kierkegaard, so he's not ranting or raving about it, right? But what the angel says, it would be a torture to a rational consciousness, is what Kant is saying in his own subdued way. So we have to reinterpret it. He must have meant change will come to an end, right? And we can conceive of an unchanging stasis, you see, but we cannot conceive of time, which is already in and of itself unchanging. We can't see it coming to an end because that would be a change, and by definition it can't change. That's where Kant is at, all right? So I'm saying in the thinking now occurring, we do in fact conceive of the end of time itself, over against Kant. But what I'm saying really broadly, over against the whole of modern consciousness. But Kant is a nice, neat place to hang it. And I also pointed out to you that quote is from the Apocalypse. And I noticed in reading today's assignment, especially the epilogue, the role of what the use I make of the term apocalypsis, which in a certain sense I had kind of forgotten about. It's nice to reread. But it's nice to have forgotten about it because it's there. So it's not, I'm not making it up, right? See? So in other words, in the thinking now occurring, we have something of an apocalyptic moment in every sense of the word. All right? In other words, we're talking about the novelty of what's going on in the history of consciousness and the history of thought. And I must say, as the thinking now occurring guy, I have to keep saying, well, yeah, there have been changes in the history of thought before. There's new forms of thought. Yes, but my way of putting it technically, there's an essentially new form of thought, right? Or as I put it, in another answer here, Chuck's questions are very provocative, but I didn't quote it here. The new beginning here is uniquely so. In other words, there have been, in some sense, always new beginnings, right? But here we have one that's qualitatively different, right? So what I was going to say was it's an apocalyptic moment in the history of thought and in the history, right? And so consistently, it's the beginning of the end of time itself. When we get into the appendices, in which this thinking is fleshed out more extensively, especially in Gamma, in the last appendices, in pretty straightforward, theological, liturgical, and therefore somewhat relatively concrete terms. When I'm thinking of what this thinking is in Novitas Mundi in those terms, it's easy to say, I could translate this, in other words, just to flesh it out a little bit. If this is the beginning of the end of time itself, well, then, putting it another way, it's the beginning of the resurrection. You see? And I was alluding to something like this last time. In other words, the notion that what modernity is trying to do is to take seriously, but as it were, to practically apply, so to speak, the notion of the salvation of the world eventuating in a new heaven and a new earth. Right? Now, this is not, I don't think it's a startlingly new concept. And one way of understanding Marx, Marx's high school dissertation, the topic was? Christ. Wrote his high school dissertation on Christ. Okay? Then he grew up to become, Marx. Okay? But for Marx, communism is, let's get real, Philosophies know we want to change the world. We don't want to think about the world, right? And a fortiori, theology is completely useless because it's kind of mind-deadening notion that you don't have to do anything, just sit back and it's all going to work out. God's going to take care of it, right? So, but Marx, it's like Heidegger being at some level. He is as committed to the notion of the sufficiency of being as Plato was, you see, or as Hegel is in his own way, at some level, right? Well, likewise, Marx, at some level, you see, is committed to the notion that the world is meant to be changed for the better. You see? He just wants to use a gun to do it. He thinks it's a more efficient, more practical, more realistic way of doing it. But he has that same kind of evangelical drive, you see, that kind of a kind of messianic notion, you see, of history, except that what? We're all the messiahs, right? We have to get together and we have to bring that kingdom of God on earth into being, right? It's not going to happen magically, right? All right. So
even though history is on our side, as he would have said.
Yes. He has that confidence.
God is on our side. I mean, he would not have put it that way.
Right. That's right. Yeah. And in that sense, he's a good Hegelian. Right? So, in a certain sense, it's a kind of practicalization or making realistic the Hegelian notion, which goes back to Aristotle, that, well, if there's potentiality, the actuality in some sense has got to be there. Otherwise, the potentiality doesn't make any sense. So he has that confidence. Yeah. So it would be his kind of atheistic belief in God, so to speak, which I think the point is saying. Okay. So the beginning of the end of time itself equals the beginning of the existence of time itself, because it comes, you see, to the same thing. If time itself exists, all right, then it's entered into the category of beginning and end. All right, it's undergoing. So in a certain sense, it's not totally unimportant, right? But at this point, it makes not too much difference whether you talk about the beginning or the end of time. I mean, it does make a difference, but what I'm saying is that if it has a beginning, which it does in creation ex nihilo, right? Then if you grant that, which by the way you probably shouldn't if you're Orthodox Aristotelian, but if you grant it, then you ought not to have any problem with it coming to an end, because any good Greek could tell you that if anything begins, it's susceptible of ending. Right? Okay, so this begins the thoroughgoing novation of existence itself that leaves no room, time, whatsoever for any form of subjectivity, including the subjectivity hitherto identifying itself with simplicity, particularity, at the expense of thought. And here I'm talking about Kierkegaard. All right. Now, so the relationship to Kierkegaard is a two-way street here. In other words, what is being appreciated in Kierkegaard is this notion of simplicity, this notion of particularity. What is being distanced from in Kierkegaard, in the thinking now occurring, is, and maybe it's a distance which, as compared to where Kierkegaard is as nothing, what's being distanced from in Kierkegaard is the notion that this simplicity cannot be thought. Right? It cannot be it's reduced to the level of his passionate commitment in contradiction to his own natural understanding. Right?
So the particularity doesn't have to be absurd.
Correct. Right. Yeah. But when it's not absurd, we're not simply going back. In other words, you could grant Kierkegaard this much, that if you're going to have a particularity in the sense in which Kierkegaard is pointing to it, if you're going to have it in such a way that it's not absurd, then you've got to have, in some real sense, a whole new ballgame. In other words, you've got to have a radical, I would like to say renovation, but that's a little too conservative. A radical novation, a radical making new of our entire understanding of the world and our experience of the world and our understanding of what it is to think, right? So you can't. So in that sense, he's right. You see, in other words, and the other thing about the historical nature of the thinking now occurring. So in other words, it's not simply saying that Hegel was simply wrong. I'm setting aside now these significant misreadings or non-readings of the history of thought by Heidegger and Hegel and so forth. The Thomistic notion and so forth is just not factoring it in the way it actually was. But setting that aside, it's not that even allowing for that, it's not that they were simply wrong, because there's no way to make that judgment until now. Right. It's something. Yeah, you got it. Okay. Let me just finish this as I started it, and then we can go back into the text. So. Then I put the little syllogism there, just to review it. You understand that all men are mortal. If you add to that Socrates is a man, then you get the conclusion, the individuation of those two premises, the synthesis that joins them together. Socrates is mortal. Okay, and then the inductive syllogism runs backwards, so to speak. How do I get the major premise? All men are mortal. I get that by combining my inspection of the world, which tells me that this fellow is a man and this fellow is dead, and if I see enough examples of that, right, then I can practically conclude to the major premise that all men are mortal. All men, in my experience, die or have died or are in the process of dying, or are able to be killed. Okay, and the abductive, which is the fancy word that Peirce likes to use for a hypothetical syllogism, right? If I see that Socrates is dead, and I know that all men are mortal as a premise, then I conclude to the middle term that Socrates is a man. He probably is a man. He's dead. All men are mortal. Now you see right away, if you think about that.
There's a fallacy there, obviously.
Well, it's not a fallacy exactly. It's just not conclusive. Well, it's a hypothesis.
Oh, okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure. It could be a dog.
It could be a dog. That's right. Yeah, it's just a hypothesis. And so then we have grades of whether you have a good hypothesis or not, whether you have whether you've considered other options, right? But the essence of a hypothesis is that movement, right? So it's a kind, and a person who likes to speak kind of everyday language once in a while calls it a guess, right? So for Peirce, this guessing, this hypothesizing what this might be, is really the driving force of all real practical working science, right? Okay. Now, so I just put that down as a kind of reminder, and then I'm trying to Kierkegaard would probably be upset with this, probably not really, but because he does it to himself sometimes, not quite this way. But I'm trying to describe Kierkegaard's position in terms of these logical terms, and why is it absurd, you see, because if I set it up in terms of the logical syllogism, in Kierkegaard, then in Kelta, the particular one, the single individual, however you want to translate it, exists after the universal. In other words, the important thing in Kierkegaard, and in this sense, goes back to this thing we were just touching on a moment ago, right? Kierkegaard's defining faith as existed by the single individual he defines it as absurd. It can only do that if he takes, in some sense, he takes seriously the synthesis of Hegel, right? In other words, the way I put it, he gives, as it were, he concedes too much ground to Hegel. He gives Hegel, he accepts Hegel's claim, in effect, to know absolutely, right? What's what? And now I'm going to oppose myself to that understanding, right? Right? Well, I have to admit I must be in an absurd position. So in that sense, he's a good Hegelian, right? Now I want to show you a way. All right. So if I set it up, then if you take the syllogism, remember I pointed out to you. We have this in English too, and I think it's in the Danish. I think it's probably in every language. There's an ambiguity between the particular person and the individual person. I mean, we do that. We don't think about it in normal conversation, right? But when you're doing this, you have to think about it a minute, right? So what is Kierkegaard doing? He's taking the individual human being, right? And he's predicating, what I'm saying here is he's predicating of the individual a particularity outside of the very syllogism that, as it were, produces the individual. In other words, the individual is the marriage, the synthesis of the universal and the particular moments. Okay? And that ought to be enough. And of course it is enough for Hegel, for reason. In other words, give me the universal, give me the particular, put them together in a synthetic unity, and then I have the concretely existing individual. And what else is, there's nothing more to be said except that is a finite, in the case of a human being, this is a finite addition, as it were, of the absolute individual, which is the Godhead. Okay, that's where Hegel. So Kierkegaard is accepting the Hegelian definition of what it means to be a human being, an individual in the technical sense, you see, and then predicating of it. I don't know whether you the reason the slash. It's like the ratio sign. The 1/2 is a half, and philosophically, when you put something under the divisor or the denominator, as it's called, the philosophical rendition of that is the predicate. So that's a shorthand for the sentence. In other words, in 1/2, unity is the subject of the sentence, and 2 is the predicate. I predicate of unity that it is 2. Right? And then the next question would be 2 what? And then on the other side you'll put 2 halves, right? Or 2.5, so whatever you want to do. See? Or 10/5. I predicate of 10 that it is 5. 5 what? 5 2s. Yeah? Okay. Simple. But I didn't invent that. I mean, that you'll find that in all kinds of places. In the history of thought. I don't know. All right. So it's pretty simple. So what I'm saying here is that Kierkegaard has taken the individual, which is the composite of the universal and the particular. Here's why he's got his problem. And by the way, I'm not saying he had any choice historically, right? But the problem emerges because he takes the individual, who the very definition of which is the union of the universal and the particular, and then, having taken that, he predicates of it a kind of freestanding particularity. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, okay, that's his problem. Okay, so in other words, he doesn't. It's not like Kierkegaard is saying. Kierkegaard has a nice little passage someplace, and I can't do it justice, which you probably can't do unless you memorize Kierkegaard. It's like quoting a poet. But he has a little passage in one of his works where he's talking about the difference between a scholar who has studied all his life. I mean, he's really devoted. He's seeking the truth, reality and so forth. He spent his whole life doing this. It's a whole day in, day out, night, long into the night. And after years and years of this, he's standing in his library one day and he says, it's useless. It's impossible. There's no way of knowing anything. He says, wow. And he says, and then this tailor is walking by outside the scholar's window, and he hears the scholar say that, and the tailor says, it's useless. All right, so taking the easy way, just say, in other words, not really appreciating. Right, so Kierkegaard has taken this thought seriously, like the scholar. Right, in other words, when he opts out, he's not opting out like the passerby, who doesn't know why he's opting out or what the implications of what he is echoing mean. Kierkegaard is opting out, really fully appreciating, right, what he's opting out of or what he is contradicting, right? So it's not like the idiot, just say, who doesn't appreciate what he's doing. He does appreciate what he's doing. It doesn't stop him from doing it, just say. And in fact, if anything, it intensifies the difficulty because he is not ignorant. Right? You could say, if fully self-aware, he denies his own understanding, but he really understands what he's doing. You see, that's the thing. Or as he sometimes puts it, the only thing you can think is that it's unthinkable. But you can, right? But to think it's unthinkable, that is, in some sense, to know what the cost of this move that he's making is. So I put it summarily. Now here's my criticism, my new criticism. I just come up with this one. I was making this. Actually, I made this because the new criticism is this: what is Kierkegaard's limitation? Okay? Kierkegaard's limitation is he exists the abstraction. In other words, do you see what I'm saying? In other words, and I've said this before, but not so succinctly, I don't think, in here. In other words, insofar as he is the scholar who opts out, having mastered the material of what it means to be, humanly speaking, rationally speaking, what it means to be a human individual. He knows what it is. Right? And now he says, no, that's right. There's something else, right? And that's not compatible, but that's right. Okay. But what so his demand, his critique of Hegel, is, as I tried to point out to you, if you read the Concluding on Scientific Postscript, it's a great, great book. You get the idea. You have to feel it. You know, he really appreciates Hegel, and the real criticism of Hegel is not just a flip thing, which he sometimes says once in a while. He'll say it easily, but it's a deep idea in Kierkegaard that Hegel's mistake was only for Kierkegaard. Only is everything. Eternity is at stake. Okay, as it were. The only mistake Hegel made was that he didn't exist his thought. Do you see that? Right? But so he's existing this thought of self-consciousness, right? But what I'm saying is, if I slow the film down, what is he saying? Hegel has given us a magnificent abstraction, but he doesn't exist it. If you're serious, you have to exist it. And Leahy is saying, well, wait a minute. I understand that in the context, but do I really want to exist an abstraction? Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you see? So in that sense, so the existence of Kierkegaard, and maybe the whole existence of existentialism, which flows from him, you see, is an existence that, in fact, is defined over against an abstraction. And I suspect that, if I abstract, can I do this? Abstract my existence from an abstraction, right? See?
Can you?
I don't. I think it's impossible. But Kierkegaard does his level best. He does his level best. Okay. All right. So now, what I'm suggesting here. Oh, and then another summary of, and this is nice because in, I don't think I can find it that quick in the next one. What is predicated of what is brought under the, here I'm trying to flesh out in you'll pardon the expression, abstract terms, what the position Kierkegaard is in. What is predicated of what is brought under the universal, the particular, what is predicated of the particular that is brought under the universal is what was brought under the universal, not brought under the universal. That's the P, the outside P under the dividing sign, right? The predicate thing. So translate that into a little less abstract language, closer to Kierkegaard. What is predicated of the self is the self not self. And I put in parentheses, but God. You see? And this is what I like about that is that it's very faithful to Kierkegaard's own language, which I quoted at the beginning of the chapter, Clarification of the Absolute, Kierkegaard, page 229. I think it's page 229. Let me see if I get this right. No, back up. I have the right one here. I'm going to look it up. No, I'm in the wrong chapter. It's page 251. Yeah, it's the first. Must be the first one, or later on, or something, wherever it is. 251. Oh, I know. It's what Kanine said. I'm doing Kierkegaard in the Husserl chapter. Okay. This is Kierkegaard, the last journal entry. You say, can you do it? You see? This is the last entry. 2 weeks later, he was in the hospital and, on his deathbed. And he's talking about a man becoming suitable for heaven, right? Becoming an angel, God kind of looking down and, saying, kind of egging him on, encouraging him, hoping he passes the test and so forth. And he says there on page 251, below the middle of the page, a couple of lines, such a man becomes an angel, and in heaven he can surely praise God. But the apprentice time, the school time, is also always the strictest time. And every time God hears praise from a man whom he brings to the uttermost point of disgust with life, God says to himself, this is the right note. He says, here it is, as though he were making a discovery. But he was prepared, for he himself was present with that man and helped him so far as God can help. And here's the point I want to emphasize. God can help what only freedom can do. Only freedom can do it. All right, so only the man, as a free agent, can do what is required. Right? But what a surprise for man to be able to express himself by thanking God, as though it were God who did it. And in his joy at being able to do this, he is so happy that he will hear nothing about himself doing it, but he thankfully attributes everything to God. And he prays God that it may remain so, that it is God who does it. For he does not believe in himself, but he believes in God. See what I'm saying? So here, the predicate, right? The simplicity, the saving grace, so to speak, you see, that is predicated of the individual, right? Is, as I say, it's the self, not the self, but God, right? But we understand that the tension here is that that's intimately bound up with the problem. In a certain sense, it begs the question, right? The only thing he can know is that what he is doing out of his own freedom, but he doesn't want to attribute to himself this grace. You see, he wants to, right, believe that there is this other, right? So when he others himself, in effect, you see, when he others himself, he still is self-conscious enough to have to make this kind of leap within the leap, if I can put it that way, at the very last minute. The leap within the leap. He never stops. The leap never stops. So is it possible to leap? Okay. Now, when I was thinking, so what I'm saying here in effect then is that to move beyond Kierkegaard, and the thinking now occurring, is not so much to move beyond particularity or simplicity or singularity in this sense, right? But it's to move beyond the attachment of that to an abstraction, to move beyond existence as the existing of the abstraction which is embodied in the syllogism. Understand here the full syllogism being the Hegelian rendition of this syllogism, all right? The one that's absolutely all-inclusive of anything that could possibly be thought, right? And so to exist this particularity would have to exist it altogether independently. And so you could see another way in which, I'm not sure it's a motive, but you could see another way of understanding how it is that the new beginning that we're talking about here has to be essentially a departure with previous forms of thought, right? In other words, there has to be a real break with those forms of thought, so that, as I say in today's reading, when we get to it, in a number of different ways, the thinking now occurring is not in opposition, right, to modernity. It's not, and nor is it, more particularly, I spend some time saying, it's not in opposition to the nothing that is unearthed in modernity. It is the thinking now occurring, as it were, leaves the nothing to itself of abstractness, right, but is fully, completely concrete, right? And so I was thinking again of Alia's image, which I remember the gestures and I don't remember the words, but we're trying to get the idea here, right? So it was something to the effect that when the self goes in, it goes so far in, I want to say it clearly disappears, and I think Alia's point was that what's left, right, is the most concrete form of the person. To say the here and now penetrating, the way I would put it, the absolute, as I put it, I think in Foundation, I don't know what I do here, absolute exteriority, right? You say, well, why use the word exterior? Well, we're bound by history in some respect, right? And so the inwardness becomes so perfectly inward in the thinking now occurring, if you want to put it that way, that it's no longer there in opposition to what is left behind. To say so, and therefore here's the thing. I mean, which I only become more aware of as I continue to think. It's probably all there, but it becomes explicit slowly, right? And in Faith and Philosophy, in the 7th chapter there, I have all these little boxes, which I like to do in Foundation. So I kind of restrain myself. I do minimum number of boxes, all right? But the key thing is in Faith and Philosophy, the culminating box, the rendition of what I call the cornerstone, the 3 logical digits, translated into Hegelian Peircean terms, and they're not perfectly synonymous, but the broad speaking. The diagonal in the box representing the thinking now occurring, the diagonal, where all the where you hit the jackpot, right? You get three eggs or whatever, right? It's 3 ends. It's 3 natures. You see, in other words, that what is left behind when you achieve a perfect freedom, what is left behind is the full, complete, concrete reality of the natural world. And it's that tension in Kierkegaard between the natural man and his spirituality, which is the negative form of the reconciliation, apparent, abstract reconciliation of spirit and nature in Hegel. So to get to that third place, so to speak, right? To get beyond the self-other opposition is to get beyond the spiritual, natural opposition that is found in its own appropriately different ways in Hegel and in Kierkegaard, to the point where I cannot any longer distinguish between nature and spirit in that sense, right? Or the exterior and the interior, except that if I have to use one of those words, the only thing I can encounter, the only thing I actually encounter concretely in traditional terms is the exterior, is the natural, is the sensible. It's very interesting that Kierkegaard makes the point in his analysis of history in terms of what he calls sensation, I think, and immediate cognition, right? And he says over and over again, I think it's in the fragments and the postscript, that I cannot know, you see, the historical based on, it's kind of a Kantian idea, you see. Based on my knowledge of time and space, I cannot know the substance in Kant, you see. Based on my sensible, immediate grasp of the world and my immediate cognition, which should remind us in a very transposed context of something of the immediacy of the act of knowledge in Aristotle. Now, Aristotle's immediate act of knowledge, even immediate is too mediated a term for Aristotle, you understand, okay? But as it were, after Hegel. In other words, that identity of the knower and the known in the act of knowing in Aristotle. Aristotle himself, because he was a good Aristotelian, can't speak about this except by using the term contact, which is really inappropriate, right? Because he's talking about an immaterial act of an immaterial being, the divine mind. Nevertheless, trying to get across something of what he's talking about, Aristotle says, well, that the divine mind is in contact with itself, kathiganon, touching itself, contacting itself, it knows. That's what he says. Now, of course, he's not speaking literally, right? But here's the point I want to make. But he uses the contact idea, right? The immediate sensation, and the analogous immediate cognition. To say Aristotle does. He uses that as the image or the metaphor for explaining the act of knowledge in a totally immaterial being, right? The thinking now occurring in its own way, therefore, is somewhat reminiscent of Aristotle, except that what? Except that we don't have to retreat from, it's no longer a metaphor. It's no longer a metaphor.
Everything's touching itself.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm having a quarrel with my biological interlocutor about it's all a semantic problem. Yeah, everything is touching itself, but with the provision that itself is the dangerous word now, right. Even though I use it myself, you see? It's a trap. So we have to be very careful. But as long as we understand, yes. Okay, but contact also implies distinction. Right. All right. So there is. Right. Okay. So the simplicity here is not, as I was saying last time, it's not a bald or abstract unity, but it's fully concrete, and therefore allows, at no sacrifice to the unity, for I would say, certainly in natural terms, an infinite multiplicity. Right? Okay.
But
yeah.
And that infinite multiplicity, could you say, is knowledge in the sense of the Aristotelian notion of knowledge, that it's knowledge in the sense that as it is, period.
Well, yes, in the sense that I think somewhere in the latter chapters of, again, Faith and Philosophy, working off a critique of Levinas, I speak of the thinking now occurring in some sense being beyond knowledge in the Levinasian use of the term, meaning, in other words, beyond the alternation, the alternatives as being and nothing, is beyond being is really being, other than being and other than nothing, other than that complex, you see, of that. Okay. So analogously, yes, if I heard what you just said correctly, it's beyond knowledge in the sense that not that there's no knowledge, but that knowledge is now not alternating with ignorance. Right? And there we go back to the Kierkegaardian idea of an immediate cognition, but now an immediate cognition which is in effect coincidental or identical with the experience of the sensible world, our sensible natural experience. Right? It's something along those lines. Okay, and then I just and so I say in effect there, in the thinking now occurring, absolute particularity equals the particular existing absolutely, the particular, the essence, the middle. I'm just trying to suggest there are many dimensions of this which you could explore, but that minor premise in the UPI thing is the particular. But it's also the place in, as Hegel well knew, it's the place of essence. Which has some interesting implications, the full implications of which I don't know that we neatly exhaust, but when you think of the importance of essence in Husserl and even the suspension of essence, as it were, in the belonging to being in Heidegger, right? So then we can speak of an essentially new world. We're speaking of a world that has a new essence. Right? So we don't have to abandon the notion of essence, but then what do we mean by new essence here? What does it mean that something is essentially new? I mean, my first suggestion is, the old image about the world standing on a turtle? Mm-hmm. I guess it's in India, and somebody asked the question, what's the turtle standing on? And then I think the ultimate, I don't know, who came up?
Turtle all the way down.
Turtles all the way down, right? Well, you could say it's like new all the way down. You see? The difference being, unlike the turtle analogy, you see, new all the way down doesn't require any kind of naive stacking. just thoroughly new, right? So that you don't need that kind of naive image.
So there's no depth in a sense.
Excellent, right? Absolute superficiality. Right. You got that? From what I just said, that's amazing. That's good. That's a good sign. I mean, I'm not amazed that you got it. I'm amazed that it's that clear. That's good. Okay. That's right. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So absolute simplicity. And then I'm just playing around here. So on the back of this, I just made my little diagram of all these independent P's grouping themselves in a circle. But I thought I did it that way because I'm a recovering idealist. And so you have to keep in mind, I thought I should also say, even though I couldn't bring myself, actually I thought it was too late, but to get the full picture here, you would also have to have a bunch of random P's. In other words, so I mean that's implicit in the fact that these P's are not connected; they're not tied together. So that they're in the circle. If you think about it, they must. What are they doing? Are they having a meeting? What are they doing? Right? Okay. The point being that they need not be in the circle. Right. So the idea of a kind of perfect freedom is another layer of this. Right. But the perfect freedom does not preclude order. Right? It neither precludes order nor does it guarantee it. Or right. So when you say to somebody that there's an essentially new consciousness, if you say to them there's an essentially new world, a not uncommon reaction is, oh, well, that's... So in other words, you're optimistic. Well, depends on what you mean by optimistic. You see? In other words, we have an opportunity now in history that we have never had before, a qualitatively, essentially new opportunity, which is deep. I mean, not just an accidental, in the normal, traditional sense of the word, not just an occasional or accidental or external, as it were, opportunity. We have an opportunity that is all the way down, all the way through, all pervasive, right? But it remains an opportunity because if it were more than an opportunity, it would not be freedom, right? It's that kind of thing. Now you could make the case, right? Where there's opportunity, there's a kind of a suggestion of hope. Right? I think opportunity carries with it a kind of hopefulness, but certainly no necessity, no guarantee, right? Something like that.
So we can kind of savor the unrequited love, even though it won't ever be completely
fulfilled
or something like that.
No, I'm not sure of that.
Okay.
I don't see the unrequited love. I think of Aristotle. Is that the reference you're making?
No, well, sort of. I mean, I know that was how you used it, but in the sense that, well, I'll drop it because if it didn't click, then
yeah,
we don't need to.
Okay, it may come up again. Okay, so I'll put that on the table because it may. I know it's relevant to what we're going to try and do here. So hopefully we'll be able to tie it in specifically to the text. But let's jump to the beginning of the Prolegomena, and now the Prolegomena was, and one reason. There were a couple of reasons for us dealing with it at this point in the course, even though it's at the beginning of the book. And one reason is that it actually was written after the 12 chapters, right? So we were actually reading it in the sense in which in the order, so to speak, in which it came to be. And it starts off with now a critical occurrence to mankind in furtherance of the end of his history. I think the key idea is, it strikes me at the moment to emphasize there that there is something occurring, and the two, I think, is also important. There is a critical occurrence to mankind. If I was writing this in 1993 or 2003, I would say to humanity or something like that, right? There's a critical occurrence to mankind, meaning that the suggestion is that this is not, I think one of the things that deeply dissociates the thinking now occurring from modern self-consciousness in all of its forms, going back to the most recent thing we were pointing out in Heidegger, that when I leap in Heidegger, I leap into a, as it were, if if we were to speak metaphysically, a kind of pre-existent relationship, you see, with being, in which I discover this sufficiency, right, in the belonging of man and being. So in a certain sense, when Heidegger goes back to the crossroads, see, even though he's going back to take a different tact, you see, he's still going back to the symbol of a kind of rootedness of the alternatives, right? He's going back to an idea of source or resource, as I think I put it. I don't know, I can't remember whether he uses the word, but I did of him, right? To a kind of original state from which some divergence was made, right? And we want to go back, right? Okay. So I think what is being said and the thinking now occurring is to deny, among other things, the notion of an origin at the root, maybe to deny the notion of a rootedness. Do you see? So part of the freedom. So it's like we have altogether left behind the part of the notion of leaping. That's why it's cheating. See, we leap in Heidegger, and he says, well, of course it looks like you're leaping into the abyss. But of course, as soon as I leap, I find out, I'm floating. I mean, I'm borne up by this original relationship I have with being, you see. So you wonder whether, right? And that reminds me also in Heidegger, I'm looking forward to a new beginning. So I'm between the old tour and the new tour, right? So he's back. So where is the leap then, right? In other words, you understand what I'm saying? Because it's just the schema that you're putting it in your mind, right? In other words, you can go back and start over in a different direction. But going back and starting over again, you're going back to the point where the two things, the unity from which they diverge.
So is it really going back, or isn't it really that all these things are kinds of provocations for the new possibility?
I understand. Yeah, that's the point I'm trying to make, but you're helping me.
Okay.
You're helping me. In other words, it's not. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not literally going back.
Yeah.
Okay, but it is in some sense. Recognizing
there's something there to be unearthed,
right,
yeah.
And something that was missed in the beginning.
Well, I don't even know that that's it. It's that, like with the Parmenides, it's like something that wasn't thought.
Okay.
Wasn't thought.
Yeah. Okay.
But which it wasn't that it was missed.
I understand. Right. It wasn't an object to be missed.
There was an event. You see, I think the event of pre-Socratic thought is not structurally different from the event of the incarnation. In that same sense, you're going back to, if you have any reference to the incarnation or creation, I'm not sure that there isn't a similar sense of what is going back to. The principle of novation is something that you're going back to. Okay, but see. Something occurred.
Right.
Something occurred.
Right.
And in your thinking, something occurred to thought.
Right.
And I'm just tweaking this with.
Right.
There's some sense in which that something occurred to thought in 6th century Greece. That's the sense of it.
Oh well. Okay. In that sense, but then everything depends on what is it that occurred to thought.
Well, it isn't discontinuous with the journey that you described, in the sense that usually one thinks of the origins of the intellectual source of the West as being, you start with Aristotle, but you could have started with Parmenides or
right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, I'm not sure what. I'm not sure what we're.
I actually don't want to deny this difference that you're making. I feel it too, but still, it's easy to miss the Heideggerian moment as some kind of return or some kind of recovery. when it really is suggesting some kind of new thing,
Right.
something that has not yet occurred.
Right.
But the opportunity for finding it is through thinking what was provoked by the earlier thinkers, or something what is provoked now by the earlier thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I don't
Or maybe the exhaustion of
of what in fact has
what,
occurred.
right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, okay. But your starting place, we're in total agreement. In other words, the idea of going back, I agree, is at best a metaphor, and it can be misleading, right? Okay. But what I was trying to emphasize was whether you're going back to get there, or whether you're going down, or whether you're going off the end of the springboard, you're leaping in order to get there. You're going, I think, in Heidegger, to some kind of source, some kind of original or pre-original relationship with being, right? And what I'm saying is that in the thinking now occurring, the difference would be is that whether it's back or down or whatever, the notion of source is left behind. And so what's being emphasized, I think, in the text is the fact of existence, right? Right. So, and I think that's consistent with what we were talking about a moment ago when we talk about this kind of sense of the completely. I was trying to find another phrase for it when I was thinking about this earlier today. A kind of completely or absolutely unconditioned concreteness, do you say, is what the person is at this stage, and to be absolutely, to be unconditionally. To be emphatic, but not just to be emphatic, to be technical, to be absolutely unconditionally the concrete person, all right, has something to do with the distinction between a thinking which thinks the fact of existence and a thinking which, in some sense, attempts in whatever direction to tap into, in whatever way, return to, even if it's a return which coincides with something new, right? What we have in the thinking now occurring is a newness which, in no sense whatsoever, is a return, whether you view it spatially, chronologically, ontologically, or whatever, right?
But then, what's its relationship to the incarnation and to creation? If in no sense whatsoever it's a return. Okay, go ahead.
Well, when you say it, all right, I'll try and answer it straightforwardly. It is the latest form, or the latest effect, the latest effect of the creation and the incarnation.
Okay. It is the creation and incarnation.
Well, yes, but the only reason I'm using the word effect is I don't want to say, because I don't want to discount the reality of history in any sense of the word and in every sense of the word. So I don't want to say it is exhaustively the creation and the incarnation. Right? So, right? And I think it's the Augustinian point, right? That the resurrection of the dead takes place at the end of the world because the body is a temporal spatial thing. So this is the creation and the incarnation in time and space. And what happens in time and space is that, the 18th century, the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st centuries are different dimensions or aspects or coordinates in the reality of time and space. So this is the creation and the incarnation now, right? Except that now I have to be careful because when I say now, the now has a comprehensive sense that it would not have had previously for thought, right? So I think this is the time in which the impact, as it were, or the effect, or if you want, without those words, in which the creation and the incarnation are realized in an essentially new way. And to put it for openers, the simplest way to understand what's new is that now it is the very creation and incarnation of the very form of thought itself. The creation and the incarnation have been thought about for 2,000 years in different ways, some of them profound. You could say Hegel thought about the creation and the incarnation in a profoundly original way. He certainly did. You see? Okay. And Thomas thought about it in his own way, not as powerfully a way, in a human way, as I think as Hegel, but nevertheless he did, right? And Augustine. So thinking has been going on with this content, so to speak, as Hegel might put it, right? And Hegel, see. And Hegel would say, well, now we come to the early part of the 19th century, and it's no longer just the content. He would say what I just said it would sound like. I think, to be fair to Hegel, he would say that now we have, in the absolute realization of self-consciousness, he wouldn't say mine in the egotistic sense, but after Kant, now we, Hegel, understanding in Hegel's thought, we now have not just the content, but we now have the pure form of this truth in scientific consciousness. That's exactly where he was at.
It is egotistical. I mean, it's like Napoleon outside of the window and at Jena happened simultaneously with the completion of the phenomenology. It is he's no bones about it.
Well, I don't know. He's got a lot. There's a lot going for Hegel. I mean, you can't just.
I'm not dissing it. I'm just
okay.
saying it is.
It's ego, but it's God's ego then. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, but the point being, all right. So again, what would be the difference, right? You see, because I'm saying in trying to answer Chuck's question, I'm working my way into a kind of idealistic Hegelian type position. You see, and so then I'm falling back on this term essence again, right? In other words, what's going to distinguish it, if anything, is not so much that claim or that form, but there's going to be something essentially different about this situation intellectually in history. And the first place to go for that difference is the absence, in this case, of any self-reference, right? The absolute objectivity, right? So Hegel had synthesized subjectivity and objectivity. Let's have an objectivity which is not this syllogistic individuation of subjectivity and objectivity. Let's have a absolute objectivity of existence, which is maybe another way of saying absolute particularity, you see, absolute otherness, right? And then we are, and in that sense, we don't have to skip over the contribution of modern thought by any stretch of the imagination. In other words, one reason why in the Prolegomena it's emphasized, I don't know whether it's explained that way, but in a simple everyday terms, one reason you don't want to set up the thinking now occurring in any kind of simple polarity with modern thought is, I think the best reason is that it's unhistorical. I mean, in other words, it's not fair, it's not true. In other words, that modern thought, in fact, one of my simple metaphors is it clears the brush. That modern thought is an attempt to clarify consciousness, right?
So it is God's work. I mean, coming back to the point I was making last time. So modernity fits into...
Well, nothing escapes providence, right? Okay, in that sense, yeah. But you could look at it that way.
But in Althaus's sense of this, you are including that sense that precisely the last impenitent and the rest of it is still the necessary part of the coming to this moment, and not just in that everything is providence, but in a part of a particular path.
Yeah, the only thing I would say about that is it's a kind of Kierkegaardian point. In retrospect, it appears to have been necessary. Whether it actually was necessary or not.
Well, if the clearing of the brush is necessary.
Yeah. All right. In some sense. Yeah.
I mean, getting to the absolutely clear clarification of the question of existence, you really do have to have gone through the stages that you.
Okay.
Because you don't even finally get to the question of existence to Heidegger.
Okay, I would just want to refine a little bit. I would say modern thought All right. In some sense, modern thought may have been necessary in order to clear the brush. Okay, I have no problem with that. However, I would say that perhaps it wasn't, it's only perhaps it wasn't necessary to have, perhaps what was not necessary was the self-restriction of modern thought. In other words, it's almost as if what it wanted to do, what it attempted to do, what in fact, therefore, it more or less did, okay? All I want to suggest is, I don't have a hard and fast position on this, but it would seem that it's not clear, at least, that it was necessary for it, that it did it in this literally self-restricted way. Might it have done it otherwise?
I give you something.
Yeah.
I think this seems parallel thinking, but it's in your ground here. You don't actually go into what Heidegger says about Aquinas, say. And he has any number of different places in which he talks about it, and he talks about it in terms of something like the procession of the different epochs of being. That the question of being arises in each great thinker and is instantly, as a question, opened and closed by the particular determination of what being is to be for that thinker. And so there's this need to keep the question open. Okay. With Aquinas, and he has a whole book that has essays and interviews called The Piety of Thinking. Do you know that one? In which he goes into why he's not a Christian and why Tillich and other people who use his work in order to do some kind of modern theology, they shouldn't do that. They should just do their own Christianity without bugging him about it. And the reason is that in Aquinas, the identification of being as ens creatum, as creation, closes off the question. Now, I'm not taking Heidegger's position, but what I'm saying is that it seems to me that has to be clarified. That the question of the relationship between being, in Aquinas' sense, and creation they'll need to be separated off. That the way that works has something to. As I'm running here, I'm not sure that I've got it all. But I want to throw this in the mix anyway. The difference between an ontical picture, which is in Heidegger, that means a picture of being, a picture of how things are, is ontical. Whereas a kind of thinking which stays at the level of what is being and how does some such picture as how things are emerge into history, that's ontological. And what do you think of that?
Well, I think it's interesting.
If I slowed down, I could work it out better.
Okay. I'm not sure. What I'm not sure is what your major point was. Forget the details.
My major point is that it seems to me you have to have gone through that kind of thinking to get to a point in which you can say the transcendental essence of existence is history, is existence, is right transparently before us, does not have self-reference. All of the different characteristics of the thinking now occurring needs to have passed through that kind of thinking. Otherwise, it's just another ontology. And its main claim is that it's not. And nobody before Heidegger was thinking about whole pictures of the world that are not just another ontology.
Okay.
That's my main point.
Okay. And I have no problem with the practical necessity. I'll compromise this way. The practical necessity of modern thought to bring us to where we are now. That's the clearing of the brush. But I'm not. What I want to say, I think I want to say, there's no. Theoretical is not the right word, but there's no essential necessity to the self-restriction of that cleanup. Okay, that's the only.
I don't see why you're saying that. I mean,
Okay.
Is it that it could have happened another way?
No, that it was a free decision. Yeah. I don't know whether it could have happened another way.
I see. You're trying to not see it as a monolithic destiny.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because a monolithic destiny would be back
to either Hegel or Heidegger.
Right,
because
exactly.
both of them have a destinying sense.
Exactly. All right. So whatever that is, that I'm resisting the notion of the necessity of it, I want to say, at root, there was a freedom operating there, and in that sense, it wasn't necessary. It wasn't destined. It wasn't. In fact, in the language of today's assignment, it wasn't determined.
Determined.
You see, and I dropped the D off determined to get a termination, which is good Latin, right? In other words, that what we have now is the termination in existence of the transcendental essence or whatever, but we don't have a determination of it, right? And D again has that notion of again from the Latin, right? A fromness, a kind of sourceness. You see, a kind of origin of, a kind of root of, right? So I want to make a kind of thoroughgoing novation, which is not a renovation, and a thoroughgoing novation, a thoroughgoing freedom of existence, and as it were now, okay, since we're in this mode, if we're going to look back retrospectively at the history of thought, I then want to hold in principle that the history of thought, its particular development, was never determined, and it was in some irreducibly important sense at every stage of the way. It shared, as it were, in this freedom, which is now, in some sense, now realized more fully and absolutely more clearly than ever before. But the freedom, I think, is there, and in that sense, right now, I don't know whether we want to spend too much more time on that, but it's important. It's important.
It reminds me of the flavor of somebody appreciating incarnation, kind of as an event, as opposed to saying, if it wasn't for the certain context of the Jews and the Romans and that historical context, this never would have happened. Instead, it did happen that way, but instead there's a complete, appreciation of the incarnation as an event, as opposed to saying it's based upon, or it's, even though it is kind of coming out of a particular history. I don't know if that just seems like a parallel thing.
Okay, but in the interest of tackling the text, let's move into on pages 5 and 6. Just want to, one of the ways in which I emphasize, I think. I'm going to have to. Okay. I think this issue comes up in the epilogue too. It's the issue of the point of view. All right. So the notion that in modern consciousness, one of the ways of grasping something essential to the self-consciousness is the notion of the point of view, and maybe on page 6, about 4th line. This appearance, or the essence of history, is in time to time its essential difference. The appearance of the transcendental essence of existence itself is, in its being, identically what has occurred to it during the course of its worldly being, or being in time, that which makes that time to be what it is, identifying it through its transcendental essence with existence itself. Therefore, it brings to time such a difference in itself as to make possible at a later time its appearance in thought as the historical essence. This possibility at a later time is in the very essence of history impossible of perception prior to its now occurring to mankind in thought. What we now see is truly seen for the first time. What we now see occurs through no necessity whatsoever, speaking of what we were just speaking of. It is the manifest freedom of the fact of creation in history at this time. So the emphasis on the at this time, meaning not that this is the only time, right? But at this time, this freedom of the fact of creation in history at this time takes the form of the thinking now occurring, all right? Which is not true of any other time, but which does not mean that that analogous impacts of this in previous times did not occur. This critical occurrence of the transcendental essence of existence in thought is the essence of its history. Manifested in the historical essence, it is the templative authority of the history and essence of thought. In the essential history of thought, this world's existence is contemplated for the first time, a fact made possible by history's essential indifference to time. For the first time, what has occurred presents itself in absolute evidence. This absolute objectivity is not an attribute claimed for itself by this thinking or assumed by it with universal consent, but this contemplative judgment beholds its authority through its own essence, absolutely attentive to existence itself. Now, if I were writing that text today, I would scratch out, or what I did for myself was bracket the word own there. That's a kind of residuum of the self-consciousness that we're moving away from, right? And its essence, I think, is okay. It's more neutral. But the owning part is, I guess what I want to say is that in the thinking now occurring, owning would be redundant. Okay? If one is absolutely concretely a particular, right? It's not necessary to say owning anymore, right? All right. Contemplating this essence of history at this time, it comprehends the latter's essential indifference to time to be for it, in its potentiality, an essential indifference to point of view. It sees so you see the connection, hopefully, between the fundamentality of the notion of a point of view in self-consciousness and the notion of owning, of having to even speak of owning, right? So I think another way of doing this, and again, I don't know where, if anywhere, I actually say it quite this way, but a simple way of saying it, I think, is what's missing in the thinking now occurring, which missing thing is it's part of its advantage, is any kind of fundamental notion of comparison. So that the absolute freedom of a fully concrete existence, which makes even the use in this text of the word own, right, jar, okay, is that a perfectly concrete particularity, by definition, by what it is, actually, the fact of its existence, is a non-comparative thing in and of itself, as it were, right? In other words, and therefore the notion of owning, in any sense of the word, even of being owned, is, as it were, redundant. But I mean, it's worse than redundant, but I'm saying minimally it would be a redundant notion, okay? So it's an essential indifference to point of view. It sees clearly that its departure at this time from thinking in the past is its separation from modern thought's very essence as it operates in the form of thought as the point of view. It is of the nature of the point of view that it passes away, that its existence is merely temporary, nor is the point of view left behind in being's ultimate recollection upon itself. And here there's another level of what's going on, at least suggested by that last sentence, that the point of view, it's the nature of the point of view to pass away. You could take that literally, or a little less literally, to be relativized, right? To be to have something of the absoluteness of the sheer fact of existence, in some sense, comparatively called into question. So whether you look at it as a passing away in time, right, or look at it in a kind of ontological sense, right? The point of view is out. Because comparison is out, because owning is redundant, and that's why I want to, even though you can use the term self interchangeably for person, at this stage of the game, I would say self is altogether left behind, but not the positive intention of modernity, you see, which comes out in the ennownment in Heidegger. The positive intention is somehow or other to have a kind of sufficiency in being, do you see, or sufficiency in existence. But now that sufficiency is, I suppose you could say, maybe also that notion is also a kind of redundancy, right? In other words, the sheer here-ness, the sheer actuality of the world, right, is no longer needs any qualification. Another way in which I like to put it is we have arrived. I mean, in this sense, we're no longer on the road, right? Which reminds me of the key role of method in Descartes, right? Method, the Greek word method means to approach, go along the road approaching something, right? Meta hodos, kind of moving along the road is the idea. So we're no longer on the road, right? Jack Kerouac with that, right? He was on. But we somehow have arrived. Now the problem with having arrived is now we no longer have any excuse for not getting on with it. I don't mean going on another trip exactly, right? In other words, we're not approaching the place any longer where we are free in this unqualified sense. We are here now. If once one realizes that, right, then as it were, one has no longer the excuse of approaching. You see, well, when I get there, I'm going to do it. And so we are here. And so the stakes, another way of putting this, right, the stakes are going up tremendously. Right? So again, this is not any kind of simply optimistic statement or insight or whatever. Right? It's that we have an opportunity which is absolutely unparalleled in history. Actually, we have the opportunity, and I guess what I'm trying to drive at here, and it's not easy to get it out. I don't think the text fully gets it out, right? But the notion that history itself is not to be confused with the temporal succession. That history itself somehow is the creative it's not the creative anything. History itself is the creation of the world, so to speak, right? Or that creation itself is the history of the world in a sense that it realizes itself fully in the here and now. At this point in time, for the first time, history itself realizes itself in the here and now at the first time. And this reminds me of Altizer. He has in one of his books, I can't remember one, it's rare for him to do it, but every once in a while he slips into a kind of scientific way of speaking. And he speaks in one of the books of a kind of, I'm not quoting it verbatim, but the idea is a kind of instantiation at every point in time and space. Right? When he thinks of the death of God, in Altizer's way of thinking, God has emptied himself out, so to speak, into the world. He has, in some sense, ceased to be the transcendent, pre-existing boogeyman for Altizer, right? That he was the God who's really a devil, right? You see, and he has quite the contrary. You see, he has absolutely identified himself with the world. All right, and so that would mean that somehow or other this dead God, or the death of God, is experienced in Altizer at every point, so to speak, in the matrix of time and space. It's something to that effect. So one of the reasons that the thinking now occurring and Altizer's death of God theology at many places seem to have a lot in common, right, is that there is some sort of agreement there. Some sort of agreement that, right, that the intellectual difference, by which I mean something broader than the simple theological difference, although they're not unrelated, would be that in the thinking now occurring, this notion which triggered this notion that I've just articulated, that in the thinking now occurring for the first time in history, history itself, creation and incarnation is history itself, and that history itself, which is for the first time now clearly understood to be creation and incarnation, is the constitution of the world of our experience. Unqualifiedly so. That's the concreteness of the here and now, right? The absolute exteriority and so forth. The major intellectual difference from Altizer, I think, is that he cannot, as he says in one of his texts, he cannot conceive of this, all right? And he cannot define it. That is, put it more simply, this for him is not a philosophical truth. It remains, in some sense, a theological truth over against a scientific understanding, or you say, and the thinking now occurring in that sense is sympathetic to the death of God in Altizer, but unsympathetic to the inability for it to be thought, to be in some new sense of the word, a genuine knowledge, right? And I would say the reason why it can't be that in Altizer, looked at in terms of our earlier conversation, is that Altizer remains a modern. In other words, at the root of his updating of the theological notion of creation and incarnation, at the root of it is, in a theological form, that same self-restrictedness. Do you see that I'm saying generally applies to people like Hegel and Heidegger and so forth and so on? That said, in terms of clarification, the worldly thrust of Altizer's theology is the analog of the clearing of the brush in modern consciousness. I mean, it's a theological analog of the philosophical clearing of the brush in modern consciousness. Okay. All right. We do say a few words on this distinction of time and history. On page 10 and 11, dropping down about 10 lines or so into page 10, this fact-evident thinking is the transcendental thought of existence itself appearing, entering into time as its historical essence. Time taken up as never before in this transcendental thought of existence is displayed in its essential otherness to history. Time's perpetuation is in fact historical as it now appears, in its pure objectivity to this absolutely active contemplation of this world's existence. And so I say, I made a note to myself, time's essential otherness to history. Nevertheless, this history is, and this is what I was saying in another way a moment ago, it is the perpetuation of time. But I don't mean that perpetuation of time in a simply temporal...
What do you mean? Say what that means.
In the sense in which Quintilian, as I told you, when he went to translate Catholicos into Latin, he needed two words. One was universalis and the other was perpetualis. Perpetual, which we use, we think of perpetual, long-lasting. But the meaning, the root meaning is seeking, peto, and the pair is seeking through to the particular, if I can update it a little bit, right? To each particular, right? So that that history itself perpetuates time in the sense that it reaches through and supports every particular moment of time. If I put this in Hegelian terms, remember now time is not simply an abstract thing and not simply a sequence of nows, although it can have that meaning in a certain context. But remember, Hegel says the finiteness of the creature is not that it is in time, but that it is time. It is temporal. You see? So if we're talking about an absolute particularity, then we're also talking about a kind of absolute, strange as it might seem, perfect finitude. See? So history supports it, a perfect finitude, a perfect temporality. In other words, at no expense to the, put it in Cartesian terms, to the not-nothingness of the finite. You see, no, quite the contrary. It is, at this point in time, absolute particularity, absolute singularity, a singularity which is not in tension with an abstract understanding of individuality. Do you see? That history itself is the constitution of such a world. And that history itself ultimately would be taken back theologically and intellectually now to creation and incarnation, which in that sense are not simply things in the past. Right? They're not simply back there, right? They are the constitution of this moment, right? What I was saying a little more naturally a moment ago, this thinking is their effect at this point in time.
Do something with the stories, identity of the story, with the storyteller, and its experience.
It's a good question. It's just you're being tough on me, Chuck.
Well,
that's all right.
We don't want the easy.
Yeah, no. Okay. Well, I don't mind the challenge. So I don't know whether I can do it justice, but for openness, because we can come back at this. So one way of defining, these are different ways of trying to get at the same reality, right? So one way of defining history in here is the identity of the story and the storyteller. All right. If the storyteller is the concrete person who has a story to tell, right, and that person is no different than the story that is being told, right, then I want to say something like this, that, well, in effect I've already said, but I'll just say it slightly different to bring it out, that the story is the person. So if I generalize a little bit, the world of my experience is who I am, because that world of my experience, remember now, is not something in any critical sense simply outside of me, you see, because that world of my experience penetrates me through and through, and now I have in principle, I have no retreat. I have no self left. I have no back room into which to withdraw. Do you see? So the story and history is the identity of the story and the storyteller. History is the absolute perpetuation of the particular, of the finitude of time, however you want to put it. Yeah.
Okay, maybe help you what it connected to is to the contemplation of existence and that relationship between templative and contemplative.
Right.
And I'm interested. What my curiosity or interest is how this storying occurs in relationship to the active contemplation. Is there some connection there? Because for me, when I think of the identity of the story and the storyteller, I'm thinking of the weaving of a story. That the story is something that's being made. It isn't. It's part of my freedom in the sense that how I tell my story, how I make my life, are part of a kind of poiesis, a kind of making that I could follow out. And when I'm trying to that very interesting notion of an active contemplation seems somehow to be connected to that.
Well, I would agree with you this far. It's yes, the notion an active contemplation would suggest a creative contemplation, a thinking which actually brings into being the story, right? So now it's where it really gets hairy. In other words, the I, in some sense, create my story. I create my experience. I create my world. But I would hasten to say I don't do so deliberately. I do so de facto. I do it in fact. It is in some sense it is what I do, but pardon me for saying this, I don't own it.
It's a storying.
Yeah. It's a perfectly selfless creating, and the sooner I get it, the freer psychologically I'll be. The more objective I will be able to be, but not the less creative. Right? I would say the more creative, right? The more objective, the more creative.
And history itself, in the larger sense of that which is continuous from the creation through the incarnation through the presence, is an ongoing story. in the sense
Yeah.
if you identify
Yeah.
Christ with existence, then the story is not only the tale in the Gospels, but is the
Yeah. And so I would hasten to say that the story isn't over.
Indeed, yeah.
See?
Yeah.
And because the story is being created, actually really being created,
That's what our actual responsibility is.
yeah, absolutely. Right? And so in that sense, it's not predetermined how the story is going to come out. You want to talk about an interactive story, right? Interactive movies. Right? Okay. Let me, one more thing analogous to this on the next page, page 11, which kind of gets to this from another direction, dropping down maybe 10 lines or so. Between the cognition and the recognition stands nothing, but the cognition is a potential existence only in the recognition, which recognition is essentially not self-perpetuating. Therefore, the recognition requires but does not affect that the appearance be the existence of another in its effect for the first time in thought. To put it directly, this new thinking now existing is in no sense essentially a return, we kind of covered this, to an earlier form of thinking, nor a rethinking of the appearance itself, returning, as it were, to that original appearance. So, in that sense, this is consistent with your reading of Heidegger, right? It understands that any turning whatsoever on its part is essentially inadvertence to the historical perpetuation of time, to the here and now, right? To the actual creation that I am doing, as it were, here and now. It turns not, it essentially appears as the transcendental thought of existence at this time. Now, only by abstracting a moment from the form of this new thinking would it even be possible to think that the appearance of the transcendental essence of existence itself returns. However, such an abstraction of a moment from existence is essentially impossible to this thinking whose essence is the essence of history. So in other words, we go back to this idea of the moment in Kant and in Kierkegaard and so forth. The moment is the creative constitution unqualifiedly of the world of our experience, and it cannot be, and it is absolutely inconceivable to abstract a moment from that. You know, so that then we would be back to where some kind of abstraction that Kierkegaard cannot get away from. Right. So, okay. I do so want to get to some other things here. Let's see. A very important one in terms of these notes and the logic and so forth. I notice in rereading this on page 19, maybe starting at the bottom of 18, the appearance of history itself does not contest this world's being. Being need not be at stake. To have it so is to deal with this world on its own terms. Indeed, such a contest of the novitas mentis, which is, briefly put, it's the novitas mentis is the thinking now occurring it's the novitas mundi in thought for the first time, right? I would say in thought as the essence of thought. Right? I probably said that elsewhere somewhere. Such a contest, all right, it's unthinkable. It would be a manifest inconsistency of the schema of an object at variance with its own existence, by which this essentially new thinking would be, in fact, assimilated to thinking in the past. To contest this world's being belongs not to this thinking's transcendent occupation with existence itself. So just to backtrack on something that Chuck brought up, we're kind of wrestling with, the question of the necessity of what has happened in history or in thought. I think we were focused on thought, but we could generalize. Well, it's one thing to say that I want to hold that it was not determined, and in that sense it was not necessitated, right? And in that sense it must always be ultimately attributed essentially to some kind of free act, okay? But it having taken place, in other words, this freedom having been exercised historically, it's not thinkable to set up after the fact an opposition to it. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, so that it belongs not to this, to contest this world's being belongs not to this thinking's transcendent occupation with existence itself. So it's done. It's over and done with, right? And in that sense, de facto, at least, de facto, it has contributed to where we are now, right? And so it's just unthinkable to contest it, which is not to say that it was necessary. In other words, it's not uncontestable because it was predetermined and had to be that way. It's uncontestable because, in fact, it did happen. In fact, that's the reality. I told you about that illumination I had when I was 30 years old, walking down the street, and all of a sudden I said, this thing called history, it's real. It's actually real. I don't believe it. Amazing. It's not all up for grabs. Here I am. Okay? Okay. It is but a transcendental preoccupation with this world's being in the form of a self-affirming essence, denying to being existence itself. But this, here's what I wanted to focus on. But this absolutely unhypothetical truth now occurring recognizes having a thesis to be its essential impossibility. So, go back to this little logic game here, right? In other words, one of the ways in which I characterize Altizer in Foundation at some length is that I say, I don't say he's into it because I'm speaking more technically, but in effect I say what he's into, what Altizer is presenting us with, intellectually understood, is the hypothetical absolute, the absolute possibility. Okay, I mean, so open that nothing can be said to actually yet have happened. Everything is possible, you might say, okay? So what's being said here is that everything is actual, right? In other words, what might be from the point of view of a modern self-consciousness at its extreme approach. See, while it's still on the road. So, I mean, Altizer is kind of also deeply and positively, and he would acknowledge, tied in some, not every way, but in some very important way to Heidegger. You see? So the notion of being, about to be, which is generally one of the ways in which I characterize modern consciousness, it's the about to be, it's future-oriented. Well, in Altizer, you get in his latest work, the notion of the absolute future, right? And in that sense, there's no possibility, and it's a deep thing. It's not that he can't figure it out. It's intrinsic to his vision, to his understanding, that it cannot be defined or conceived. You see, because it is, in a certain sense, this very positive blank in the sense of a very real, ultimate possibility, right? And that's deep in modern consciousness. You see, and he has, in his own way, theologically surfaced that possibility as an absolute. Okay, but this is, in that sense, so far beyond it, yet so close, as I say in a number of places in my writing. Very close. He's got the possibility of an essentially new world. He's gone so far as to conceive the possibility of it, but he can't conceive it.
There's a slight change in the use of possibility that would work here.
Okay.
In which possibility is not the kind of vague oncoming of a desideratum, but is the very condition of factuality. That is, when you're in the fact,
right, that's
where the possibility opens. Not where you're in a vague condition, out of touch with the facts, and therefore there's a blank in the future. It's the condition of fact that is the condition of possibility. That is the condition of openness and the condition of responsibility. The continuous transformation of factuality into new possibility.
Okay. I think I hear what you're saying, but I'm not sure that I can find that factuality.
Well, not ality, fact.
Or fact,
yeah,
in Altizer.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
This is Stein here.
Oh, okay. Well, hey, Stein, you're all right. But I thought you were talking about Altizer. No. Okay.
Putting it all.
Okay. All right. 293. So let's jump a little bit into the epilogue, and I'm rereading this, and I was interested to find that it actually made sense. This thing on Neoplatonism on page 293. Therefore, Neoplatonism, about 8 or 9 lines up from the bottom, in its presupposition of the fact in essence, places the fact of existence itself absolutely beyond thought. But it is clear that the Neoplatonic absolute, the one, is just that, the appearance of the transcendental essence of existence itself denied. The flight of the alone to the alone, what I'm really saying, if I put this in less polite or abstract terms, Neoplatonism is essentially reactionary to the events, or the event that was taking place at the beginning of the first millennium. This, in essence, is what the formal reconstruction of ancient metaphysics is. It is a denial of the appearance of the fact, in essence, not a denial of the fact, essentially impossible, but a denial of the appearance of the fact, or a formal denial of the essence of history. Now, the note I made to myself, and this carries over onto page, let's see if I can, let me just carry the thought in the text further. On page 294, about 10 lines down, the thinking that begins with the appearance of the transcendental essence of existence affirms the existence of the essence of history, taking to itself as the primary fact of its thinking the fact of existence itself. Thereby it transforms itself for the first time into the transcendental form of reason. Now, this is a kind of historical review here, right? So, when I talk about transforming itself into the transcendental form of reason, I'm pointing towards somebody like Aquinas. The fact of existence is its formal presupposition, since as Neoplatonism clearly demonstrates, the same fact essentially presupposed is absolutely beyond thought. Modern thought hypothesizes that the fact of existence belongs to thought apart from its affirmation of the existence of the essence of history. The fact of existence becomes the material presupposition of thought, or the thought of existence. Modern thought, then, does not deny the essence of history as Neoplatonism does. Rather, modernity appropriates the essence of history as indistinguishable from its own thought of existence. It banks upon its identity in thought with this world's apparent essence to avail itself of a formally infinite power. At the bottom of page 294, indeed, the essential hypothesis that modern thought is, so in that sense, I'm saying, when I say Altizer is giving us the absolute hypothetical, right? In a certain sense, I also characterize him as being modern self-consciousness in extremis, right? At its furthest reach, and under some pressure from its own kind of absolute self-exhaustion. Indeed, the essential hypothesis that modern thought proves itself to be correct. That is, within the limits of its own ambition. See, this kind of shows how everything goes together here. It is true enough. Okay? Now, what's the key thing? What's the key phrase there? It's true enough. Well, it's not true enough for the thinking now occurring, but within the limits of its own ambition, and then slow the film down. Within the limits of the ambition of its own, it's true enough. You know, see? So when I get rid of the owning as the limit of my ambition, right? If the limit of my ambition is not an owning of any sort, whether it's the metaphysical owning or the non-metaphysical owning, right? Then it's not true enough, right? It's self-restriction. I wanted to draw though a little more neatly the relationship to Neoplatonism, which I did in a note, and it's probably in the text in germ. The turning modernity, I'm saying, is in effect the turning inside out, or upside down, or pick your reversal metaphor. The denial, it's the turning inside out or upside down of the denial of the appearance of the fact of the appearance of the fact into the affirmation of that appearance in the form of thought / matter, such that Kierkegaard insists that the affirmation take the form of existence or matter. Let me translate that. In other words, what I'm saying is that Neoplatonism denied, in effect, the appearance of the fact. Emphasize the word appearance of fact. On the logical principle that you can't deny the fact. This is a fact, right? Okay. Deny the appearance of the fact. I'm saying modernity turns and there are deep, you read it and you wonder, and some people call Altizer a Gnostic, Well, he is, yeah, but he's an inside-out Gnostic. Right? He's a Gnostic for whom the evil God who created the world was the good God. See? So Neoplatonism turned inside out is this modern absolute self-consciousness, which now is not denying the appearance, but it's affirming the appearance. And I'm saying Kierkegaard, qua modern, his complaint, going back to it here, is not with the abstraction, but only that the abstraction needs to be existed. So he existed. Translate. Kierkegaard's objection is not to the modernity's turning denial of the appearance of the fact into affirmation. He just wants that affirmation to be done existentially. Do you see what I'm saying? And that's why he can't think it. He can only affirm it. And you see this, the use of affirmation in Altizer sprinkled through there, because deeply he is also, and going back to this distinction of whether or not I'm saying whatever the possibility is that's rooted in the fact, fine, but is the fact in Altizer? And I think instead of the fact in Altizer, we have the affirmation in Altizer, a kind of pure affirmation, if I can put it that way, or in terms of the analysis of this text, I speak of him, although I don't mention him. When I'm talking about the will, the benevolent will, all ties us into the willing of a new world. Do you see? But it remains a matter of will, right? Or more broadly, a matter of affirmation. And it can't actually think it, define it concretely. It can't think the fact because it remains tied to this willfulness and to this self-reference, something like that. But we've pushed the clock, so I'm going to pause for a week.